me tonight is Jason McPhee from the Knuckleheads of Liberty. Jason, we're talking about authoritarianism at home, and hey, check it out, I said that properly this time. It's, for those of you who don't know, I was having trouble speaking it before we started, just so we know.
We beat it into it.
I practiced my intro. It went well. All right, so we've got lots of problems with authoritarianism growing at home, and we're going to start off by kind of moving off that subject a little bit. But there's a crippling problem with renewable or green energy, and that is the storage problem, right? Because the wind doesn't blow when there's no wind turbines don't work when the wind doesn't blow. Solar panels don't work when the sun doesn't shine or when there's snow or high overcast. There's all kinds of problems with those kind of things. And so in order to deal with that, you need some form of long-term storage. And either that's batteries, or they're trying this thing in Australia where they pump water from one reservoir up to the next, and so they use water as storage. As big lake reservoirs water, they're working on that. And so there's a lot of ways to massively engineer these kind of long-term storage, but a lot of these times is, you're never going to actually get back the pollution you created to create those systems, right?
And that's actually one of the critiques people have about some of the electric vehicles too, and I think there's a little bit of debate about that, so I don't want to be absolute on that issue, but there's a lot of pollution that goes into just creating the batteries for the cars, and so and there's very few of these rare earth mineral mines around the world, and we could have them here, but we actually don't want them here in this country because we're too afraid of the pollution that comes from mining the stuff that you need to make electric cars. So yeah, it's funny. You talk about authoritarian. You said it was a digression, but I guess this is really an example of authoritarianism because a lot of the renewables currently aren't being driven by just market and choice. They're being driven by authoritarian edicts in a lot of cases.
Yeah, they wouldn't survive without subsidies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of these, there's no market for them without the massive government subsidies or tax. They complain about the tax things for oil, but there's no renewable industry at all without subsidies.
Yeah, well, it's not just the subsidies too. I mean, there are edicts of how much renewables actually have to be on the grid too. So it's not necessarily telling who has to make them, but still you are saying that X amount of this has to be renewables. So, and oddly, they don't include nuclear in that mix, which might solve some of these problems.
They don't include nuclear, and in California, they don't include hydro.
Yeah.
Hydro doesn't count as renewable for some reason in California, and so you're limiting yourself even there, despite hydro being, especially if the dam is already there. It's one of the cleanest things you can do, and just like running an old car. Keeping an old car well maintained is actually cleaner than buying an electric vehicle. It's the same thing. Keeping an old dam well maintained and running and upgrading the turbines is far more cleaner than building a wind farm or a solar farm. And just remember, when you build a wind farm or a solar farm, you're not just you're destroying the land that's sitting on. You're making it unusable essentially for anything else, especially in a desert where you've covered up desert. Desert with shaded desert, which is desert isn't supposed to be shaded. And so, all those creatures that do or don't live, all the microbes that do, you've changed the environment of those deserts that these wind farms are.
Wait, there is one caveat too when you said old car. When we say old car, we're talking like 20 years old. We're not talking about like 1950s, because if you're running like a 1950s car, that's going to be pretty dirty.
Well, even if you're talking about something from the 1970s, essentially after the catalytic converter was put in, or if you modernize an old car, right? You put in a modern engine into an old car, it's still, you're still saving. Do an LS swap. You can get a more powerful engine and save the environment. So there you go. There's my hint for green for you. Get a 1960s thing and do an LS swap. You can save the environment. There's one way to do it. But it's the problem with this is, as always, it's these dictates, as we've talked about. We may have, if it wasn't for these dictates, someone may have come up with a solution that is not viable because of subsidies. Yeah. Because the subsidies took the research dollars that would have otherwise gone to hydrogen exploration or whatever it is, because Toyota has some interesting views on hydrogen coming up.
Yeah, it's interesting. Toyota is one of the few companies that is not quite on board with Go Electric. And the big part of the reason why a lot of the companies are on board with Go Electric, it's not necessarily that they would have gotten there on their own. It's just that they see all these edicts and mandates coming down around the world, and the issue is, are you going to try and sort of fight that losing cause, or are you just going to get in line behind what all of the regulators want and say, okay, fine, we're making these things?
Yeah, because you don't have a choice, right? Because you've been mandated from the government. You have to sell 20% of your cars, 50% of your cars have to be electric. Well, even if the customers don't want them, like a lot of these electric trucks are just sitting on dealership lots because they're $100,000 and $120,000, and no one wants a $120,000 truck that can only go 100 miles. Yeah. And can't really tow anything because, you know, they're work trucks. And if you can't use a work truck to tow things and to go long distances and to be there when you need it, there's no point. Yeah.
You know, for those of you who are really like liberty oriented and are willing to dive the extra mile, Soho Forum recently, which is sort of a libertarian debate forum, they just recently had a debate on electric vehicles. So that's certainly one to go check out if you want to dive a little bit deeper into this, because they actually had some good points on both sides.
My only problem with electric vehicles, and we were talking before the show where I was talking with the crew inside, this thing is, I don't want to be dependent on the grid. I just don't. You know, I can have a diesel motor and I can essentially make diesel fuel out of practically anything, right? If you've got a diesel car, you can make fuel out of practically anything. You're not dependent on anybody but your own ingenuity. But with an electric car, you're entirely dependent on the grid, or you're dependent on the handful of solar chargers taking 3 days to charge your car so you can go 100 miles, 100 and 200 miles, and it's not worth it. You just, you know, go diesel if you're worried about the end of the world. It's got, and we're talking about the end of the world. Biden has issued an executive order forcing AI companies to share safety test results with the government. Essentially, the government wants to know about the algorithms, what they do, what they don't, and how they're written, and it's the first step to the government regulating AI. And let's be clear, at the moment, AI is not actually artificial intelligence. It's just algorithms with really fast computers. That's all it is. It's not actually artificial intelligence in any way that we would think of it. Yeah. It's not what we're dealing with.
Well, you know, that's one of the funny things, ironic things, I guess you'd think too, is that somebody like Biden and our central planners, who we're not even sure if they have intelligence, are going to set the rules for artificial intelligence.
The people who have no idea, people who couldn't design an app to save their lives are now going to want to be the ones to say, hey, we're gonna make sure that this AI and their algorithms are safe, without defining what safe means, without defining, you know. It's just really, what evidence does we have that the government is actually going to be able to do this competently? Yeah. Is there any evidence anywhere?
Well, but one of the things that disturbs me a little bit too, and you know, we saw this recently post-COVID, you know, where the government was literally trying to regulate speech, and they had their they were going to have their board of misinformation, which is kind of like a Orwellian Ministry of Truth within the Department of Homeland Security. And the idea was they were going to try and tell us what was safe information and what was unsafe information. Well, if you are the government, now you're saying we're going to go in and make the rules on AI, perhaps there's safe think for AI and unsafe think for AI. So I noticed one of the things in the article was that they were going to be giving extra grants and other things for AI that was going to be used for climate change modeling. And so the idea is, you know, well, it looks like there's going to be some AI that's more favored by government than others. And, you know, that's kind of worrisome. That I think maybe the big safety concern here is that government is going to be getting his hands in here.
I know, and there's already times where the AI now won't actually answer a question. I asked it to revise an email I was sending the other day, and it said in a professional tone, and it goes, I can't write that email in a professional tone because it may be harmful to the person who's receiving it. What the heck are you talking about? How is this going to be harmful anymore? How can you write it any more harmful than what I've just wrote? I don't understand how you're professionalizing my tone is going to make it more harmful, but yet you don't want to because it was a personal thing and there was, you know, they didn't want to interject itself, which I can actually respect from a private company. Hey, look, we don't want no part of this. You know, you're asking us to do something we're not comfortable with, so the answer is no. That's fine, but if the government's telling them to say no to that request, That's actually a vastly different thing. And the question is, with these kind of things, with these kind of executive orders happening more and more and more often from not just the feds, from the state governments like California, from the EU, we no longer know who's actually in control of the algorithms,
Exactly.
if at all.
Yeah.
If anybody at all, and that's the other part, because the algorithms is you can design an algorithm, but the algorithms are dependent upon my inputs. And so you can jailbreak, the AI, just like you can manipulate your Facebook algorithm. If you're tired of negativity or what on your Facebook algorithm or whatever algorithm you want, search Fiji vacations, and you'll start seeing lots of stuff about Fiji vacations and vacation spots and stuff. Your algorithm will be filled with vacation things, and you can actually control your own algorithms. And many people, when they complain about social media, it's what they're really complaining about is the mirror that they're reflecting. It's because your algorithm feed is a reflection of you. It's a reflection of what you engage with. It's not a reflection of that the algorithm wants you to see. It's a reflection of what you engage with.
Yeah, well, I think it's a little bit of that reflection of you and maybe some tweaks from that initial program.
Yeah, and you'll get the sponsored content and those kind of things will pop up, and that's fine. I'm one of the few people who don't mind ads because I don't want to pay for things. So I'm much happier to see an ad for 2 seconds than to pay for something. I'm one of the handful of people. I'm not afraid of my information being given to marketers because they're terrible at their job. And so I actually did the thing last night, Jason. I Googled my own name and nothing came up. Really, James Just. You go up James Just, and it's just stuff about James the Just from the old religious guy. So I'm one of the few people who's free to kind of do what I want.
Well, there is one thing about this whole AI thing that I think maybe there is at least a small role for government in, and it's not so much the issue of the safety that we were talking about, but if we truly had AI being developed and you have this issue of real consciousness, perhaps starting to think about what should the rights of AI be as an individual. Now that's, to me, is starting to become a really interesting question.
That's actually a far more interesting question. It's like, for those of you who Star Trek, the data question, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's the same thing. And that's actually the thing to be fearing about. And our politicians often use fear to sell things. And our correspondent from the fields, Mr. Richard Fields, has something to say about that. So let's see what he's got. Mr. Fields.
Report from the fields. In 1798, Thomas Malthus predicted that the relative prosperity the human race was enjoying at the time would end in sorrow. He predicted that food production would increase arithmetically while the population would increase geometrically, leading to shortages of food. It seems he has been wrong for 225 years now. Just in my 76-year lifetime, the yield of dry land corn has increased from about 30 bushels per acre to a nationwide average of 177 bushels per acre. 200 to 300 bushel yields under good growing conditions is common. So corn production has increased nearly sixfold. Meanwhile, the population is up by only about 2.5 times. Looks like Malthus got it backwards. Population has risen arithmetically while food production has increased geometrically. Lesson learned, right? The population doomsters are laughably wrong and should be safely ignored, except they keep popping up and spreading the same message of fear and need for massive government regulation. In 1968, Paul and Anne Ehrlich wrote in The Population Bomb, which said, and I quote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate," end quote. Well, it seems we survived the 70s. In fact, at the end of the 70s, in 1980, economist Julian Simon made a $10,000 bet with Ehrlich that 5 commodities of Ehrlich's choice would go down in inflation-adjusted price in 10 years by 1990. Ehrlich chose copper, tin, nickel, tungsten, and chromium. He lost the bet. When Al Gore became vice president, he was given authority of the president's newly established President's Council on Sustainable Development. Gore's first priority was to make sure everyone in a position of authority in the Clinton administration hewed religiously to the narrative of human caused global warming. Indeed, when the director of energy research at the Department of Energy testified before Congress that the scientific data did not support the hypothesis of global warming, he was summarily fired. Administrative state bureaucrats have towed the line ever since. Gore went on to produce the movie An Inconvenient Truth, which predicted apocalyptic dying polar bears, inundated coastal cities, spreading diseases, hurricanes, and tornadoes wiping out cities, and food supplies exterminated by droughts. None of these dire predictions came to pass, but Al Gore's net worth increased from 2 million to 399 million. What's the point of all these scary stories other than Halloween was just a few days ago? It's that in politics, fear sells. If a politician is telling you to be afraid of something, best to hold your wallet in a very safe place. I'm Richard Fields with Report from the Fields.
I say it's something you have to hold more than your wallet, and that's your freedom in a safe place, because it's not just your wallet that they go after, it's something actually more important, and that's your freedom that we have lost. Because one, don't take policy advice from people who think the human animal is a parasite. It's just not a good idea. I mean,
well, the funny thing is they're never referring to themselves. They're always referring to you.
To other people. And we talk about, starvation. Starvation nowadays only happens in places where it's essentially forced to happen by politics. Starvation is no longer a matter of having enough food and being able to get the food to the places where people are. It's the only reason you can't get food to the places where people are is because someone's not letting you.
Well, and it's funny too. It's always the places with all the planners that can't seem to get the food to where it needs to go, right? I mean, it's the people who think they know better than everybody else. Instead of letting people follow price signals to the most efficient solutions, they have people at the top who will tell you. And I mean, that's what Venezuela is going through. And there's just been story after story after story of country who's experimented with this stuff and just, gone. They found scarcity is what they
well, they've been using fear to control us forever, from hiding under desks for fear of the nuclear weapons to peak oil, which was never actually a thing, but we're all supposed to have it. We've got how many times are we supposed to was climate change going to destroy societies, destroy civilization? In my 50 years, 4 or 5 times by now, right? I think I've survived these theoretical end of civilizations 4 or 5 times now. And so
well, it's funny because the ultimate error is the hubris of these planners. They often, a lot of times their best friends are scientists, and scientists tend not to be economists most of the time, and so this is sort of where they go awry. Is that scientists are excellent bean counters. So when they talk about the end of the age of oil, they're saying, well, we have this many barrels of oil in the ground, and we have this much demand, and therefore it's, we'll just do a little calculation, and we're going to run out in this year. But the problem is they don't understand is that as scarcity happens in a marketplace, price signals will drive alternatives. Price signals will drive new efficiencies. And that's exactly what happens, and that's why we didn't hit that end of the age of oil when it was predicted, because these guys, they have this hubris of thinking, well, I can count the beans, and therefore I can predict everything, and they can't predict human ingenuity and how people are going to respond as free people in a marketplace driven by price signals. Yeah,
they can't predict the technology changes that will say, hey, now we can find oil at the bottom of the sea in places that we used to not be able to reach. Mm-hmm. Technology now allows us to get to oil that we used to be able to get to, and allows us to find oil in places that we used to not be able to find oil. And so, anyway, there's a lot of technology changes or knowledge changes. We now know more. We now just simply, Richard talked about, food production is up because we're better at farming. Imagine that. Over time we got better at farming, not, the same. Yeah. Our equipment got better. We have less waste. We maximize, the acre now. There's lots of things we can do that we didn't used to be able to do. So we're going to move on to authoritarianism. The Supreme Court has expressed, several of the justices in the Supreme Court have expressed dismay at how long some cities and states are taking to return property that was, shall we say, not rightfully taken, or may have not been rightfully taken. So we're talking about asset forfeiture, and specifically in this one, the case in question is over a car, but it's the same as people taking money at, or cops will seize money from travelers. Or it's the point is, if someone is not charged with a crime, or someone else was using their car, how long, what's the process of getting that back? I didn't involve myself in a crime, but you've seized my car, so now I have to wait a year to get my car back and pay ungodly sums of money. I didn't do anything wrong. My car didn't do anything wrong, but yet I'm being punished. And so the Supreme Court there's at least some justices that are dubious of this asset forfeiture. And for those of us as libertarians, we know that asset forfeiture is it's a very dangerous precedent, right, to allow law enforcement to benefit from seizing the assets of, suspects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the incentive is that a lot of these law enforcement agencies will get to keep some portion of that for their budgets. And this is an extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, you're essentially telling somebody that the incentive is if you can go out and, essentially get more collars on people, then you're going to get a benefit. And usually in a marketplace, we like to see that kind of incentive. But when you're talking about the government taking away people's freedoms and property, that's not really an incentive that you want to see happening there. And unfortunately, that's what we have going on in so many places. And it's so absurd that they will literally have cases where the case is not against the person. The case is literally against a pile of money that they found in somebody's car, or against the car. And, so it's like, and then you have to go convince the state that the car is not illegal property or whatever.
Yeah, the car is innocent. My car is innocent. You have to go prove to the state that, no, that's the money my grandma gave me and I was going to go use it to buy a house. It's not drug money. It's actually flipped where, the government has to prove you're guilty, rather than now you have to prove you're innocent, and that's actually a vastly different thing. And the other thing is, it takes forever. And if you're a wage worker, you don't have the time or money to go through this. And so a lot of people just give their property up because it's actually cheaper.
Yeah. Well, and ultimately, I mean, and many economists like, Walter Williams and others have made this point countlessly that, if the state has the right to take your stuff, you aren't free. I mean, you're essentially a slave if everything you produce can just be taken by the state on a whim. So, a lot of times I think, Democrats can, at least in the past, not around COVID, but in the far past, they used to be pretty good on civil liberties, but they used to never get the economic thing. But that's the other side of the coin is when you take away the fruits of somebody's labor, you're essentially making them your slaves. So.
Yeah, you're making somebody poor, whether it's by taking their stuff or by taking the fruits of their labor. You're still taking their things. There's something that disturbed me. I was listening to the Sacramento County board meeting last week, and one of the board members mentioned that, there's a lot of mental health issues with the homeless people on the street. And one of his solutions was, when we get some of these mental hospitals built, that we put out essentially a bounty program or a reward program for people who turn in someone they think is mentally ill. And if those people get sent to a hospital, you get a small cash fund reward, right? That's the thing. But there's problems with this. A Montana psychiatric hospital is so poorly run, the patients there are neglected, and there's a lawsuit about patients being died because they're not caring. Many people blame Ronald Reagan for closing the mental hospitals here in California, but they also forget that that was a federal lawsuit that actually forced those mental hospitals to be closed because they were prisons for people who were socially unacceptable. And they weren't just, remember, these were putting gay people in mental hospitals and then just forgetting about them, right? Essentially the same thing was happened here. And now we're headed right back down to this thing, because what happens with the people you don't care about, and let's say we've proven we don't care about the homeless people, right? The government has proven they don't care about them because they've made life complicated and expensive, and they're the ones who put them there. And so now we're gonna take those same people, we're gonna put them in essentially a prison type setting. You call it a hospital all you want, but it's still gonna be a prison. They're still gonna be locked in there. They're not gonna be able to leave. And you expect them to be treated well? I just don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to end up being back to another House of Horrors, the very same thing that we did 50 years ago when we said this is morally wrong.
Yeah, and ultimately this is the problem. Whenever you know, certainly, you know, if somebody is mentally deranged, there's a chance they may be infringing upon somebody else's rights. But how do you decide when somebody is mentally deranged? I mean, you know, it's as you gave the example of gay people, and you know, certainly we saw it was. Was it Alan Turing or one of those guys? I can't remember the guy who was. Gosh, they made a movie about him. You know, he made the decoding machine.
Yeah, the decoding machine. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, he was you know, gay, and that was a crime where he was at, and they. I believe they lobotomized him, didn't they? Or they did something.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly.
They gave him some psychiatric drugs to take away his sex drive and everything else because he didn't think the same as they did. And it's not, you know, as long as you're, if you're thinking different but you're not harming anybody, then that shouldn't be a crime, you know, at least not for libertarians. I know for a lot of other people in other parties it is, but.
Well, and, you know, libertarians do actually have a difficult position here, because things like, you know, you should have the right to, you know, inject and use whatever drugs you want, but at the same time you don't have a right to minimize or diminish other people's use of public spaces or their lifestyle. You don't have a right to, you know, you don't have a right to set up a camp on in front of somebody's house, you know, all these various things. And so when you get this, I know we're out of time and I'm running out of so I don't know, we're just headed, this whole thing's got me distressed because we're headed down a road that we've been through before. Those of us who know history, we can clearly see it, but it's hard to explain to people that, you know, we've been here before. We know this is a danger. Jason, we've got 30 seconds. You got anything to wrap this up with?
Gosh, I would say, you know what, just hold on to your liberty. And you know, if you've been watching this show or Knucklehead to Liberty, think about what you can do for liberty in your neighborhood. Help join the cause.
All right, thank you, Jason. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for being here tonight. Please remember to love everybody, and good night.
I don't think that's call to action.
No. No, I think you're good on calls to action there. I lost my train of thought.
I didn't realize we were that close to the
No, and I lost my train of thought, and then you said,